Thank you, Phil, and I would just like to extend a warm thank you to Ian and Jen and everyone that I've met so far along the way today. It's been a really excellent day to kind of move around to all the different classroom setting and a wonderful lunch, and I feel I've been welcomed with open arms, and so it's great to be here with what is another, looks like it's another wonderful room of people. I'm actually warmed by the fact that there are a number of people here that are interested in what can be a fairly technical and often legalistic intervention into what are very serious and significant social issues at play. So I'm happy to have everyone here today. And what I want to talk about is a development that has been recurring over the previous 3 years, surfacing in the media, certainly within Canada and in the United States, certainly in England, in Great Britain, and Australia, where there is a concern around the use of end-to-end encrypted messaging applications and other encryption technologies. The concern being, on behalf of law enforcement, that these technologies are obfuscating the intercept and readability of communications either in transit or at rest in a plain text mode. And so the concern is that certainly after the, around 2013 and after the Snowden revelations, that a broader, more ubiquitous adoption of end-to-end encrypted messaging technologies have interfered with the capacities and abilities of law enforcement. We'll discuss this. That's the law enforcement argument, and that's one of the driving public policy arguments in this discussion. But there are a significant number of other issues at play, not least many of the concerns that would come with trying to ascertain the necessity of any proposal to interrupt, weaken, or undermine encryption, and some of the technical concerns and some of the follow-on concerns for privacy, human rights, and communication, as they are intimately connected to any attempt, intimately connected to end-to-end communications, encrypted communications. So there's been a lot of discussion about how to legislate and whether legislating is to undermine or weaken encryption is a fool's errand. And some countries within the Five Eyes arrangement have held off. Canada has not explicitly legislated. The UK has. They haven't actually enforced their legislation, so they have legislation on the books, but they haven't enforced it. And the United States got close with something around Apple versus FBI, but ultimately a lot of key legal developments in terms of judicial input were not a part of policy setting there, and so it was delayed until recently around in Australia. There's been significant discussion about legislating on measures that would facilitate lawful access to encrypted communications. And it was talked about for a couple of years, and the legislation was never actually tabled in Parliament. It was discussed. We heard from the Attorney General that legislation was on its way. The next sitting session would come, it would go, and the legislation wouldn't come. And so we actually, many of us, I say we because yes, I am a lecturer in a department of criminology there, and I'm also have spent a lot of time working with the Australian Privacy Foundation, submitting written submissions to government, giving oral testimony for committees, and we've been fairly active in the policy space on these types of issues. And so much of actually what I'm going to talk about today is more on the side of my engagement on the policy side, even though there's a lot of crossover between the two. You won't find too many theory citations in this, or maybe any, in this particular presentation. Nevertheless, these issues are one where legislation finally came, and so we have engaged it. It's a draft proposal. We've picked it up, we've turned it over, we've inspected it, evaluated it, and we have submitted a written proposal to Parliament on this draft legislation from the Australian Home Office. And I want to talk to you about that particular proposal, but why it matters for an audience in Canada is perhaps less understood than why it matters for an audience in Australia. For many in this room, I think many will know the simple fact is that if you weaken or undermine security and integrity of information communication infrastructures anywhere, insofar as those platforms or technologies have global reach, by extension, you undermine them in every jurisdiction. So the significance for Canadians, and I'll talk about this, is real. And so I think this talk, in spite of actually couching it in what are a lot of sometimes arcane and very interesting ways to come at law in Australia, these are fundamentally issues that will have significant relevancy for a Canadian audience. Not least because I saw yesterday that the RCMP mentioned that their capabilities around interception are being obfuscated by end-to-end communications. So this has been a live issue in many Five Eyes countries for quite some time. It's one that ebbs and flows, and it looks like, at least in the Canadian context, that it's one that will be on the horizon again, and it looks like with some imminency around potential legislation. So the hope is that there are some learnings and some insight that potentially could be drawn from the Australian case. So I want to talk to you about this bill. I want to talk to you briefly about some of the nuances of the Australian jurisdiction, what sets it apart from a legal setting like Canada. And I want to go through the various aspects of the bill. And I'll conclude with some key takeaways that I think would have broad applicability, not only in Australia, but much further for questions of human rights, due process, and cybersecurity. So the Australian political context is one where there has been a recent history, at least since 9/11, where there has been a very enthusiastic approach to legislating in national security. Professor George Williams is a law professor at UNSW, University of New South Wales. He did a study that looked at a number of statutes that had been passed that existed in Australia, I should say, that had the potential to encroach on things like rights, democratic freedoms, and free speech. He found that in the Australian books there were approximately around 350 statutes. 209 of those had been passed since 9/11, and 64 of those were specific to anti-terrorism measures. So the approach to dealing with national security issues in Australia is one that is driven by significant legislation. There is an approach to law and order, and there's an approach to furthering powers of law enforcement and intelligence authorities as a way to deliver public safety. And the expectation is that legislation is a primary tool to achieve those aims. This is actually recognizable by what is a number of surveillance, I would say a number of surveillance powers and policies that have emerged, at least in the past 5 years. We've seen a national facial recognition biometric program. We've seen mandatory data retention requirements for telcos to store data for a minimum of 2 years, which are accessible without a warrant, judicial or any judicial authorization. We've seen expanded powers in the use of computer network operations, or what the Brits call equipment interference, more popularly termed lawful hacking. There are a range of measures that when these types of offenses sit on the books, well, a way to enforce those laws is the administration of those laws in a way that facilitates enhanced forms of intelligence, investigation, and detection and intervention. Third, the context is that the Australian government, to achieve these aims, has been they've been able to, they've not shied away from mandating the private sector to facilitate these ends. They do exert significant pressure on telecommunications and telecommunications companies and internet service providers. But they also balance that with what are civil immunity protections. And so they're readily willing to compel the private sector to do things on their behalf to facilitate intercept or to facilitate questions around enhanced security. But they always will balance this with immunity from liability around those particular activities. These three characteristics are important for thinking through this bill. Now, what does the legal environment look like? Many might be surprised to know that there is no formal Bill of Rights in Australia. There's nothing like a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There is no similar document to the US Constitution. There is a constitution in terms of government, but it is about separation of powers and the ordering of the political system. But there is no formal Bill of Rights that would provide some checks around questions like reasonable search and seizure or free speech rights. That doesn't mean that similar types of rights don't exist. It just means that they're written into the primary legislation. So they have to be written and passed in separate acts, and through that they exist and inform case law. So there's no outside judicial authority that then scrutinizes, in the sense that, in the Canadian sense where there's a Charter of Rights, it actually scrutinizes according to a static constitution. These are primarily written in a piecemeal fashion into primary legislation. That matters, and we'll get to that. Where there is a Human Rights Act, there are some at state level. There is one in the state of Victoria, where I am, in Melbourne. But there are exceptions around questions of sort of impacts associated with security, national security operations. And so where a Bill of Rights exists, it doesn't have too much applicability when it comes to national security issues. This doesn't mean that there are no rights. Primary legislation. Second is there's a need to pass legislation that complies with Australia's obligations before the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they've signed on to the ICCPR, which has some privacy protections. And the expectation is that any law that gets passed must be in accord with their international law obligations. Now, that being said, there's no binding mechanism domestically for a cause of action if there is seen to be a violation with international law. So it's largely normative. It's functionally, some might say useless, others might say limited. Third, there is a Privacy Act. So the Privacy Act is primarily not around the interception. That's all somewhere else. But the Privacy Act is more about what the private sector and public bodies can do with information once they have it in their possession. More to do with how information can be shared and for what purposes. And of course, what recourse citizens have to access information about themselves and so on. In this particular context, there is an exemption for intelligence agencies under the Privacy Act. So Australia's equivalency of CSIS, ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, is not removed. They're taken out of the Privacy Act altogether. For police and other law enforcement bodies, they have extensive exceptions, and so the only limitation on sharing of information under the Privacy Act occurs where that sharing would be outside of the regular duties to perform their mandate. In other words, you can share information if it's associated with an investigation. You cannot share information if it's trying to send information to your brother or sister to do whatever they want to do with it. It has to be within the established mandate. So that's, you can obviously, I run a whole course on this. This is kind of silly to do it in 2 slides, but these are the sort of key things that must be taken under consideration when we get into what is the more finely grained detail of this bill. So this brings us to the present debate. The going dark debate is one that has been happening for quite some time. I won't really rehearse the arguments here. I think many of you are probably familiar with them. I mentioned some of them at the outset. But I do want to talk about how this has been taken up in the Australian context, because I don't think many of you have probably heard about this. Now former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, some of you might have heard this, was when asked about the government's intentions to weaken or undermine end-to-end encryption to facilitate lawful access, Malcolm Turnbull stated that encryption is wonderful and all, but the laws of math are no match for government intention and government's ability to intercept communications, which I think certainly set off social media, just because of the fact that encryption is a mathematical problem that cannot be solved by anyone, let alone by public policy. And in spite of that, I think many civil society groups then sort of seized on that to begin to make their arguments. But I think what's interesting is that underneath a lot of this more surface level humor, and it's fair to say Turnbull got caught in saying something that he didn't quite understand, and he was kind of embarrassed about, he was made to be embarrassed over it. Nevertheless, there is a lot of statistics and justifications being made about policies that could have a potential to weaken or undermine end-to-end encryption. If you remember FBI Director Christopher Wray saying last year that the FBI had encountered 7,000 iPhones, and those 7,000 devices were impeding investigation. It was many, many months later that number had been revised down to 1,200 iPhones. It's very, very different. But what does 7,000 iPhones that are in FBI's possession even actually mean? Does that mean that they couldn't use endpoint cracking technology to get into the devices? Does it mean that those phones were material to an investigation even? Or does it mean that they seized them? Does it mean that they were unable to go to Apple and get an iCloud backup, for instance, that would have facilitated access to the devices? Does it mean that they were unable to access metadata that would facilitate an ongoing investigation and in other words, arrive at a successful conclusion to their investigation? What's the relationship to crime clearance rates? Does that mean less crimes are being cleared? The moment we actually crack open these statistics that tend to be proposed in media reports, and not even in media reports, I would say in parliamentary discourse, we immediately see a very complex issue and one that is limited in terms of the grounds that we're on to be able to understand, debate, and arrive at a meaningful conclusion. In Australia, the Australian Federal Police just noted that they had 90% of investigations involve some form of encryption. That sounds high. I also don't know what it means. That was up from 65% in 2014, 2018, March 2018, and that the 90% is from September. How has that changed, and what's responsible for the change? So I think we're really operating in a vacuum in terms of informed, independent, evidence-based decision-making. We don't know what those figures include. Presumably, they might or they might not exclude other capabilities and powers. So at the crux of this is that once we consider the trade-offs for security and the corollary that other malicious actors can basically leverage their own malicious intent through a broader weakening of security and integrity of information communication infrastructure, then we don't know the necessity of these powers. We're not even actually able to have an informed debate about them. On top of this is that a recent US survey by the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that there are other issues that frustrate lawful access that have nothing to do with encryption. They ranked as being, quote, significantly higher than the impediments posed by end-to-end encrypted messaging apps. Those issues referred to not knowing the appropriate platform to go to, or not knowing the correct procedure for engaging with the private sector to access information that might be relevant. So it's clear that there are certain organizational and educational and training impediments associated with accessing information that is already available through legal authority. And I think that's notable. Nevertheless, we have legislation that was proposed on the 10th of August. It was publicly disclosed by the Home Office, the Australian Home Office. It was draft legislation, which means it hasn't yet been tabled. At that time, it hadn't yet been tabled in Parliament. And they tried to solicit submissions from the private sector, civil society groups, other experts, and many people took them up on this. There was the Australian Information Industry Association had a submission that went in. Within them, they represent brands like Apple and Microsoft, Adobe. There was the Digital Industry Group Incorporated. That's a association that represents the interests of Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Oath, and Google. And there was also a submission put in by a number of civil society groups, Digital Rights Watch, the Australian Privacy Foundation, Access Now, which is US-based, and Electronic Frontiers Australia. There were also about 14,918 submissions that were put in off of a form letter that Australians could modify and submit, which I think for draft legislation is not small. That's notable. And so submissions for that were a 3-week window, which is fairly tight. for many people that are doing full-time jobs and this on the side, like myself. And I was also on recreation leave. And so when I had come back, we ended up pulling this submission together. If anyone is interested in the submission, I'm happy to share it with you. Please just email me. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is derived from the work that we put in on this submission. It's worth noting that the bill was introduced into Parliament, tabled into Parliament just 10 days after submission to the draft exposure were closed. 8 days if you're counting business days. So it left the Liberal Party room floor with very, very minor changes, very few changes. And there were extensive number of recommendations that were made. For this submission, just sort of full disclosure, we recommended that the legislation should be scrapped and separated. I think there were a lot of parts of it that were poorly conceived and could a number of avoidable risks that could be, that were part of the bill that could be avoided. And so there are three main parts to the bill. The first is the part that says, industry, you must do this, and here's how we're going to make you do it. The second is the hacking powers that say we want to revise the powers that we have to facilitate remote search and seizure of devices. And the third is enhanced search warrants around things like compelled password disclosure. So what thresholds and circumstances exist for requiring an individual to disclose the password to their iPhone or their passcode. There's more to this. There's mutual legal assistance. There's customs. This is a very big bill. In terms of amendments alone, it was 186 pages of amendments. In terms of the explanatory memorandum, it was over 100 pages. It's massive, and so 3 weeks to pour through what are incredibly sophisticated technical arguments was tiring. So the first schedule, industry assistance. There was a new definition for designated communications providers. This means that it's not just telcos or ISPs. It means that anyone, whether you're a software developer, a hardware manufacturer, a journalist, a university, a small or large business, you run a babysitting company for dogs, and you have a website, you're in. So broadly applicable. Website operator, it's hard to think of too many entities that would not actually be captured under these obligations. There are three main ways that the government can facilitate industry assistance to encrypted communications in plain text. The first is what's called the voluntary technical assistance. Sorry, we get in the weeds a bit, but hopefully you can stick with me here. We get into a voluntary technical assistance request, which basically says, we want to ask you to do a thing for us. We basically want you to intercept the communication. You can hand it over to us, and it's fine if you remove security controls to facilitate that. We'll give you civil liability. So if you have to share any kind of information around IP to facilitate that, that's fine. We won't. There are no penalties for that. Or we might also ask that you build a new capability that you don't already have to assist agencies. There's no decision-making or public interest criteria associated with this request in the current legislation. That means the voluntary request has no checks around necessity, reasonableness, or proportionality. It's not included in a voluntary request. I'll get into the information disclosure around it too. The second is a technical assistance notice, which says, we're not going to ask you to do a thing, but we're going to compel you to, which means on behalf of a Director General of Security, so through ministerial authorization, or the head of an interception agency, so that could be the director of ASIO or the head of Australian Federal Police, to issue a technical assistance notice where a communications provider must do specific acts or things where they are capable of doing so. So you must already have this capacity, but you must do it. This is the justifications for this is to enforce the laws domestically or foreign, protecting the public revenue, or safeguarding national security. Again, very, very broad interpretations, but the decision-making criteria here is that there is a reasonableness proportionate check, and that compliance must both be practical and technically feasible. Notably, however, that actually comes through an Attorney General. It's ministerial authorization. There's no outside judicial input through a Charter of Rights on what reasonableness or proportionality means. It's up to an Attorney General to basically provide an evaluation of what's reasonable and proportionate within the bill itself. What does this actually mean in terms of where the rubber hits the road, technically speaking? Well, Apple has keys for iCloud backup, iMessage backup if it's activated, Gmail, again, they hold keys on their servers, so that means Drive, Calendar, Dropbox. It might also mean anyone who has the ability to push a update could include malicious code in that update. This is also unclear, though, because what we've been trying to do in the past little bit is actually do the meticulous sort of, okay, well, what's in and what's out, the kind of line by line on it. And what we found, if there's any server-side key storage, I would expect that to be in. The third is a technical capability notice that requires not just what you already have the capacity to do, but you have to build a capacity that's beyond what you have. The AG, again, must be reasonable, proportionate, practical, technically feasible. Any digital communications provider can write back and say, hey, here's why we can't do this. And the AG would consider why that in the decision-making process of whether that's reasonable and proportionate. It's for the enforcement of domestic and foreign laws. As I noted, that includes a broad range of domestic and foreign agencies that can utilize the same capability. So it raises an issue where Australia becomes the weakest link for global requests, which is significant in terms of the Canadian side. And it increases possibility for transnational regulatory arbitrage, a collective weakening of human rights globally, insofar as there's an opportunity to circumvent what might be tighter restrictions in one's own jurisdiction. Outsourcing in the business terminology. So what can't be required? That sounds bad. And so what can't be required? Well, there are some things that can't be required, and hopefully it makes you feel a little bit better. It might not. The only limit is that a communication provider cannot implement or build a systemic weakness or a systemic vulnerability. Raises a question, what is a systemic vulnerability? How do you actually define what systemic is? And this is one of the issues that we have is like, well, or that I have, I should say, I shouldn't speak for anyone. What I have is how do you, and others I should say, how do you begin to define systemic in a systemic vulnerability? If you have a vulnerability in software that's actually scaled to devices globally, is that not systemic? and there's an exploit related to that. Is that not systemic? One of the other explicit limits is building a new decryption capability or requiring one or more actions that would render systemic methods of authentication or encryption less effective. So it looks like everything is probably going through exploits related to software vulns. So what I think, and I've kind of arrived at, I think, is that it rules in the administration of spyware capabilities that are going to be delivered by providers rather than off the shelf from your folks at Hacking Team or Gamma or wherever. I think that it's safe to say that this would rule out something like Apple versus FBI. Having Apple write new code that would allow for a brute force attack on iPhones, I don't think would be caught in this. That doesn't mean that there's not significant problems associated with this. So what's at risk for non-compliance and enforcement? If you're in Australia and you're a telco and you don't comply, you lose your license. If you're a designated communications provider, I mean, that's obviously pretty significant. If you're a designated communications provider, non-compliance by body corporations is punishable with a $10 million levy. I put that in US dollars because I anticipate that those who wish to not comply would probably like to see that figure in US dollars. And that's 7.28 million. And if you're a person, it's 50,000 Australian. Yes?
Is this even not complying with the requests or only the...
The voluntary request, if it's rebuffed, would basically just be moved to a compelled. And then it's refusing to comply with the compelled. Yeah. But it raises an important question about what's the value of consumer trust. Does this become an operating cost to preserve security and integrity and consumer trust? Recall after the PRISM leaks or the Snowden leaks that, I think it was suggested that cost Silicon Valley companies upwards of 40 billion in their market share. So I wanted to try and fix this one. Is how much would the AA bill cost the Australian US cloud computing industry? And we'll kind of see how that shakes down. For anyone that should want to disclose any of this information, would be met with a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment for any provider, entrusted person, or government officer, except if you're administrating the project. That means you can talk to your lawyer and so on. Transparency reporting means that there will only be numerical figures published on how many of these requests are actually issued. So that means that the private sector can say, we got 10 TCNs, and that's all. Only numerical. No other information. Anything to do with any characteristics or nature of that request would be a violation. For the government, they too will actually disclose the number of requests that they've made. And this always raises an interesting game of like, who's keeping good books and so on. I like that game. You often see these interesting disparities. And so, yeah, so where are we at with this is that this is obviously insanely broad. It has global reach. It has significant capacity to weaken trust in global supply chains, to perform a supply chain attack. It's big. And the definition of systemic weakness or systemic vulnerability, that is going to need judicial input. However, right now as it stands, there is no judicial input. It's the Attorney General's interpretation. So you have a situation where you have an individual that does not have technical expertise, presumably might be staffed and trying to seek input, but there's nothing in there that says there should be multi-stakeholder engagement. There's nothing in there that says there should even be something like a vulnerabilities equities policy in place that would actually assess the risks of holding on to keeping information about a vulnerability secret for intelligence and offensive purposes versus disclosing it so it can be patched to facilitate broader public safety. It seems to be a decision-making criteria that is not taking into consideration public interest in a broadly defined way that would make room for independent research into things like vulnerability rediscovery, which is a very, right now, is a very young form of inquiry. The likelihood that someone else might discover the same vulnerability while you have it secret and use it against you or somewhere else versus disclosing it and patching it. There's conflicting information about how long a vulnerability until it gets rediscovered and potentially used by foreign states, by organized crime. And so this is something that's just not actually even, not even being touched with the barge pole in terms of this draft legislation. Over-reliance on ministerial discretion and authorization means that a broadly defined list of acts or things are left up to administrative consideration. So there's serious limits to adequacy in decision-making, as I mentioned, and a lack of a formal Bill of Rights, a constitutional right structure that could facilitate not just the preservation of rights around things like reasonableness, necessity, proportionality, but actually clarify gray law, actually provide some certainty in an environment, a regulatory environment. One of the byproducts, and I don't know how often this gets talked about, but one of the byproducts of a Bill of Rights is that it has the capacity to clarify gray holes in primary legislation, particularly in an environment where technology is changing so fast. So that's useful. That's actually useful for sound planning. And it's not just, so there's an efficiency argument there versus relying on members of parliament in Australia to have to actually have to go back and update legislation repeatedly. So this has gone pretty long. I kind of want to go back through to answer questions, but there's a whole range of hacking powers that are in here. I'll give you just briefly some of the key issues with hacking. There's a legal definition of computer in there that is incredibly broad. It doesn't actually, because there's no outside Bill of Rights, that means how you define it in the primary legislation, that's where your scope is at, by and large. So if you define a computer as a computer or a network of devices or any combination therein, that means your core internet infrastructure is included. That means your telecommunications facilities are included. That means your endpoints are included. That means your routers are included. That means that there's no way to assess proportionality with a single warrant. So the warrant there, I should say, is that the only check on limits here is that, yes, it does go to a judge, and judge must consider the extent to which privacy of a person is to be affected, which is great. I think that's fantastic. But again, that actually rests on a situation where there is judicial adequacy. Judges don't know the technical environment. There are no education programs and training programs that I know of in Australia, and I've looked, where there is education and training on technical issues. And nor have I actually seen any judges solicit the use of amici in their decision making. So this is actually, I think, a critical issue that's not just specific to Australia, but it's one that's specific to Canada and the United States as well. The weak link here is having a judiciary with a clear understanding of what's at stake in terms of breaking things. Again, something like where vulnerabilities equities policy could be useful. Lastly, compelled password requirements means if you don't disclose your password, if a law enforcement officer asks, you face 5 years imprisonment for a simple offense, 10 years for an aggravated offense. That sounds severe. It's also something that quite likely could not exist here in Canada because of the Charter. Again, there's a right to be free from self-incrimination, Fifth Amendment in the US, but also government-compelled speech is just not typically on the cards here. Shifts the onus from government investigating, making a case through a court of law, facilitates due process rights. Those due process rights are turned over when the onus is actually on the individual to disclose out of fear of penalty. In an era where many people forget their passwords routinely, you have a password manager, you have two-factor authentication. What if you don't get it through one of those factors? There's lots of technical issues at play that would make this quite problematic to implement and could catch some genuinely innocent people. Yeah.
Just flip back there. It says it's an offense when an individual cannot comply with a police request.
Refuses to or cannot. Yeah, that's direct. That's. Yeah.
So the password is not yours. The password is somebody else's password. You have no idea what this password is. You cannot comply. You are in violation of this law.
It reads that way. Yeah. Whether they update it out of the draft legislation is possible, but it does raise an issue about decentralized forms of access. Yeah.
Is it, under what circumstances can they request it? Like, can they just stop and frisk you on the street and say,
no, I mean,
this phone?
there would be, there's not the same thing as probable cause. There's a reasonableness threshold in terms of compelling a password, but the range of offenses are, like the threshold of offenses can be quite low. So, like a summary offense can still be 5 years.
Just on that point, I mean, I'm assuming what they're thinking in terms of is you'd be charged with this, but then it'd go before a judge, right? You'd be in a trial circumstance in which there'd be a dispute over this, and then the arresting agency would have to demonstrate that there's other reasons to believe that the person knowingly is carrying, let's say, information with regard to a terrorist attack, having someone else's phone, let's say, and not having access to it. It's still very suspect, but I'm sure that's the reason for the language.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah. And also the way that some of these things work for pretrial arrangements, where it's a lot of this stuff won't potentially even, some of it might not go to trial, some of it will, not all the evidence will go to trial, and so on. And so there's a lot of ground to cover before you even get to that point where that might be useful for compelling information. Okay, so quick conclusions. I had to try and pull out what I thought were the kind of key takeaways here. The first is this bill actually reaffirms a lot of the chronic deficiencies around meaningful separation of powers in Australia. It feels kind of funny because you get this new bill and you're reading it and analyzing it and preparing a submission, and you think, but what about like all the old things that now just sort of like continue to slip in the past? So I kind of tried to use it as an opportunity to like bring some of these old deficiencies in, and that's an ongoing issue about adequacy in decision making. Second is this lack of Bill of Rights feeds into issues of clarity in understanding the legislation, and issues where code is interpreted as speech are also limited, which might be a significant bulwark against these same measures in the United States. Third is that, and I think this is a very significant one, is that the prospects of transnational sort of post-legal arbitrage around access is significant. To me, that's massive. The security issues are very clear, disincentivizes vulnerability disclosure. In fact, not only disincentivizes it, criminalizes it. And it increases the likelihood that government loses control over their own vulnerabilities or exploits, which happens all of the time. This is going to be a sweet, sweet honeypot. Foreign states, and I think particularly malicious actors are very interested from a signals intelligence perspective to see how this is going to play out. So the number of actors that might be engaging in what's called fourth-party collection on the same kind of vulnerabilities or exploits are going to continue with this particular policy. So I would say there's a need to establish a robust vulnerabilities equities process through multi-stakeholder input to try and actually mitigate what some of the security risks of this legislation are. The economic concerns are also significant. Serious breach for consumer trust. Companies are concerned about that. And there's also costs for Australian enterprises that for instance, want to set up shop or run shop through Europe. They would be in violation with GDPR. But this is interesting because they wouldn't be able to actually disclose that. So this raises a foreign policy issue between Europe and Australia. So the moment you start to pull at these threads, it gets into really difficult territory. And hopefully we can talk about some of those threads in our questions. And if you want a copy of that report, email me. I can send you the link to all the different submissions that went up as well. You can get a good overview of private sector to civil society. So I'd be happy to chat further about these developments. Thank you. The question is that in Canada, there is some difficulty in clarifying contradictions between various acts that might include the same or similar definitions, and that there is some judicial input or case law that can help out with that, particularly with the Bill of Rights. And that the question was that in the Australian context, how do you encounter this problem when there is no formal Bill of Rights and you have a range of legislation that is overlapping, sometimes contradictory, and sort of how do you follow on with that? I would just say that when I moved to Australia, some of the reason why I was involved with the Australian Privacy Foundation was to actually be in the trenches to deal with what is been referred to by a federal court judge there as legislative porridge, and it is. And I mean, there is the same or similar powers in the operational side that can fit under multiple acts, and with government hacking, these powers are not new. The Australian law enforcement bodies have been able to hack there using the Surveillance Devices Act. Under the Surveillance Devices Act, in Queensland at least, also different federally, but in Queensland, they had a court ruling that defined a mobile device as a listening device. And so we're able to justify a remote access Trojan to activate a mobile device as a listening device and use that to remove data. So what sits under a warrant category under the Surveillance Devices Act is, most members of Parliament, I think, when it comes to transparency reporting, would look at that line and say, oh, this many audio surveillance warrants, or listening device warrants were issued. And there's a complete disconnect between the accountability reporting and the operation environment, not only just the legal side about what applies and doesn't. So this bill actually tried to combine the hacking side of this, actually just tried to clarify a lot of that and introduce computer access warrants as its own category. And what's so crazy about a lot of this is that now, even in the reporting side, is that if you get a warrant where you have both a computer access warrant and, let's say, an optical surveillance device warrant recording inside a home, and you get two of them in the same warrant, which you can do, then when reporting comes around, it gets reported as a composite, and you get a numerical figure beside the word composite. The word composite in annual reports year to year completely demolish all the rest of the categories in terms of its numerical figures. There's so many composite warrants. So members of parliament, even with what would be a mechanism for ascertaining transparency and accountability, are not able to use them meaningfully. I would say it compromises transparency and accountability with citizens and civil society groups. It's an issue that is significant, not just in terms of trying to have the lowest common denominator for lawful authority to it was like play to the edge of the box type situation in an operation. You just find the lowest common denominator, and you can probably fit it under. And but that also reverberates into mechanisms for transparency and accountability. So to me, there's a situation where the present day operational environment is disconnected from the legal terminology, the legislative environment, and Roger Brownsword, who writes stuff on regulation, speaks of regulatory disconnect, and this is actually like one of those sort of like key kind of aspects, or key sort of embodies a key example of that. That would be very difficult. So the question was, there have been pushes in Canada to actually have a systemic review of a stock taking, as it were, of existing legislation and how it relates to the facts on the ground, and that's long overdue. The legal culture there, the culture has been one of just repeated amendments. There has not even really been I don't think, a limited systematic approach to drafting and passing legislation there. I've tried to communicate this with other submissions and through oral testimony before parliamentary committees to limited effect.